Okay, good. So 2023 has been a summer of records, and not in a good way. Um, July was the hottest month in human history, and in the first week of August, the global average sea surface temperature hit 20.96 degrees Celsius, breaking the record from 2016. The wildfires in Canada doubled the smoke emissions record set the year before. And of course, most recently, there are the heartbreaking fires in Maui. Hi, my name is Palmer Owyoung, and my talk is called What I've Learned by Writing a Book About Climate Change. My book is called Solving the Climate Crisis, and it advocates for transitioning to a nature based economy, which is different from capitalism because it puts nature first. In the book, I share dozens of ideas on how we can all help solve climate change, but I didn't want to be a Pollyanna, so the book is very grounded in science and data. Some of the things that you're going to learn about in this talk are how we can adapt to climate change, who is most to blame, some potential solutions, and the three most effective things that you can do to help fight climate change. This talk's about 15 minutes long, and I'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you have a question, just put it in the chat box. If there's one thing that you should take away from this talk, it is this. Climate change is a solvable problem, but we can't trust governments and corporations to do it alone. We also need individual and collective action. So what you choose to do or not to do matters. A little bit about myself and how I came to write this book. My background's in education and entrepreneurship. I'm from Alameda, California in the Bay Area, but I live in Phuket, Thailand now. And I started off as a volunteer activist cleaning up beaches. And then I started to write a column for the Phuket News about ways to fix local environmental issues. What it made me realize is that there are existing solutions to all of our environmental problems, including climate change. Now, it's hard to talk about being hopeful about climate change when the world's on fire. But that's, I think, exactly why we need to focus on solutions more than ever. Since fires, floods, heat waves, and droughts are going to be our new normal, we need to know how to adapt to them. And the answer is through local government. According to the United Nations Development Program, local governments handle over 70% of climate change reduction measures and up to 90% of climate change adaptation measures. The problem is voter turnout in local elections for 10 of America's 30 largest cities was less than 15%. In some cities, it was in the single digits. So if we're going to mitigate and adapt to climate change, we need more voter participation in elections for local government, and we need more candidates that care about sustainability. Now, one myth is that adapting to climate change will be bad for the economy. But according to a 2019 report from the Global Commission on Adaptation and the World Resources Institute, if the world invested $1.7 trillion over the next decade into climate adaptation, it could generate $7.1 trillion in total benefits that come from saving lives, lower healthcare costs, preventing infrastructure damage, and preventing supply chain cuts. Some ways the report says that we can adapt to climate change are by repairing mangrove forests to protect against floods, building sponge cities that are designed to collect and reuse water with water catchments, more parks, more native plants and trees. Some ways that cities can stay cool are by adding awnings to walkways, adding rooftop and vertical gardens, and adding more plants to the interiors of buildings. We can also paint building rooftops white, which can lower the internal temperature by up to 30%, reducing the need for air conditioning. We can paint city roads with a gray paint called Cool Seal, which lowers surrounding temperatures by as much as 5 degrees Fahrenheit. According to an MIT study, if we used Cool Seal in cities across the United States, we could reduce the frequency of heat waves by 41%. If you want to cool your home, air coolers, also known as swamp coolers, are inexpensive devices that can cool a small room by between 5 degrees to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And they require 80% less energy than air conditioners, and they don't require any refrigerant. Water shortages are also another problem we're seeing. And one of the most effective ways to save water is using a technology developed by Israel called drip irrigation. This can reduce water usage by 40 to 70% by applying a small amount of water to the roots of crops in the mornings and evenings. Since agriculture uses 70% of the world's fresh water and only 10% of U.S. farmers use drip irrigation, this is the single most effective fix there is to water shortages. Israel also recycles 90% of their wastewater compared to only 5% in the United States. So even though we have a water shortage problem, we also need to acknowledge that we have a water management problem. For example, the average American uses 156 gallons a day, while the average Israeli uses just 36 gallons a day. So Americans use an average of 4 times more water than Israelis do. Wildfires are another issue that we need to solve. They have become 4 times larger and 3 times more frequent in the United States since the year 2000. One proven method of preventing fires is using a Native American technique called controlled burns, which reduces the amount of fuel a wildfire has by mimicking natural fires. Another tool is called Wildfire AID, which combines AI with satellite images, weather data, social media posts to prevent fires. If a fire does start, the tool can detect it and quickly predict how it will spread. Another adaptation is for homeowners to make their houses fire resistant. This means installing a roof made with non-flammable materials and adding vents covered by a mesh to the attic or crawl spaces to prevent embers from entering, and creating a 5-foot perimeter around your house that's non-flammable. So where would the money for climate adaptation come from? Again, the cost for adapting to climate change would be about 1.7 trillion over 10 years, or 170 billion per year. Today, the world already spends $1.8 trillion per year for subsidies for fossil fuels, farming, fishing, forestry, and water. According to a 2022 study, the majority of this money is harmful to the environment, it harms people's health, and contributes to climate change. So paying for climate change adaptation measures would just mean reallocating less than 10% of global subsidies. I'm sorry, my dog's, I got to kick my dog out. The next thing I learned is that the wealthy are the most responsible for climate change. It's probably no surprise that the wealthy emit more CO2, but it's the egregiousness of the gap between the rich and poor that is surprising. A study of 20 famous billionaires revealed that their average carbon footprint came in at a whopping 8,190 tons per year, mostly because of their helicopters, yachts, and private planes. The average American emits 14.8 tons. The average global citizen emits 4.2 tons. So just one of these billionaires emits 1,950 times more than an average global citizen. The top 10% emit close to half the world's greenhouse gases. The top 1% emit 15% of emissions, more than twice the amount of the bottom 50%. So that means that the top 80 million people emit more than twice that of the bottom 4 billion. And another way to look at it is that one person in the top 1% emits as much as 100 in the bottom half. So the wealthiest 1% generates roughly half the world's aviation emissions. An Oxfam study says that to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, the top 1% need to cut their emissions by 97%. One way to do this is creating a luxury tax for helicopters, yachts, private planes, and high carbon lifestyles. This is also known as a sin tax, and we know that they work because they've been applied to sugar, alcohol, and tobacco, and both Singapore and Canada have one. So let's talk about some solutions. In his book, No Miracle Needed, Stanford engineering professor Mark Jacobson puts together a comprehensive plan based on real-world data that shows we could replace 80 to 85% of fossil fuels by 2030 and 100% by 2050 with existing renewable energy technology. His plan would also create 28 million new jobs, save 5.3 million lives from air pollution, lower healthcare costs, lower energy costs, and lower inflation while using 1% fossil. The cost is $62 trillion spent over the next 3 decades, or about 2.2 trillion per year. However, the plan could pay for itself in just 1.5 years from the savings in healthcare and electricity costs. Another solution that isn't talked about enough is restoring natural carbon sinks, which include mangroves, peat bogs, forests, and the soil. According to one study, this could sequester and store 30% of our CO2 emissions per year. Oceans also absorb 22% of the planet's CO2 emissions in the form of marine plants and animals. So protecting whales and sea otters are two of the best ways to help protect our oceans, because whale poo acts as a fertilizer for phytoplankton, and sea otters protect kelp forests from sea urchins. So how do we pay for the transition off fossil fuels? Think about how much more the wealthy contribute to climate change for a second. Remember, the top 1% emit more than twice the CO2 that the bottom 50%. So the obvious solution is a wealth tax. Just 2% annually for those who have over 5 million, 3% for those who have more than 50 million, and 5% for billionaires would yield $2.52 trillion a year. That would be more than enough to pay for all of Mark Jacobson's renewable energy plan, and it would leave $300 billion per year to fix our natural carbon sinks. So what's the government doing to fight climate change? In 2022, the US passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which allocated $369 billion in tax credits towards cutting emissions. According to a 2023 study published in Science, the good news is that the Inflation Reduction Act has already increased the average rate of emissions cuts in the United States. The bad news is that we need to decrease by 6% per year to meet our goals of cutting emissions in half by 2030. And so this is why individual and collective action is so important, because they could make up the difference between decreasing emissions from 4% to 6%. But why do I believe this? So we can look at changes in marijuana laws, gay marriage, racism, and gender inequality as evidence that society does change. But we also have to ask how society changes. And there's 2 primary ways. The first is called social contagion. Studies show that individuals affect each other by 3 degrees of influence. This means that if you buy solar panels or an electric vehicle, then your friends are more likely to as well. That's 1 degree. But also your friend's friend, 2 degrees, and even your friend's friend, 3 degrees. So changing your own behavior can reverberate through your social network, causing other people to change their behavior as well. Then there's the 25% rule, which says that it takes just 25% of a population for a social movement to establish a new social norm. This means that a committed minority can change society. So what can you do about it? The most obvious thing is to start with your own carbon footprint. And you know these things: drive less, fly less, install a heat pump, eat less meat and dairy. But don't do these things alone. Do them with an existing group of friends or work colleagues. This way you can share ideas, make a bigger impact, and hold each other accountable. The second thing is to vote and participate in local government. Since in many major cities, less than 15% of voters take part, your vote will have a bigger impact. The third is to give to the right climate nonprofits. But there's 400 climate-related nonprofits in the US alone. So the website givinggreen.earth uses a method called effective altruism, which fuses charitable giving with econometrics and answers the question of where donating a dollar does the most good. So it's evidence-based giving. The conclusion is that giving to organizations that affect climate policy is about 10 to 20 times more effective than giving to organizations that are trying to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Their website has a list of the top 5 charities to give to, and they include the Clean Air Task Force, the Evergreen Collaborative, the Good Energy Collective, the Good Food Institute, and Industrious Labs. All of these nonprofits influence policies in energy, food, or heavy industry. For example, the Clean Air Task Force can eliminate approximately 1 metric ton of CO2 for between 12 cents and $1. By comparison, most organizations can't avert a metric ton for less than $2. So turning our individual collections into collective action and amplifying our impact by voting and direct donating to the right climate charities could make enough of a difference to decrease our emissions from 4% per year to 6%. This would help keep us on target to reducing our emissions by half by 2030 and increase our likelihood of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. So that's my talk. If you'd like to learn about dozens more ideas on how to fight climate change, how we can transition to a nature-based economy and fix the oceans, fix the forest, fix the food system, and why there are reasons to have hope about climate change, please buy my book, Solving the Climate Crisis, and I'll leave a link in the chat box. And now I'll take questions. Lou, any questions out there? Okay, hold on, I'll get you the charities. Okay, well, the easiest thing to do is just go to givinggreen.earth, okay? That's the easiest thing to do, and they have a list of the 5 charities. How realistic is the chance a wealthy tax for climate control in the United States? I think it's actually very realistic, and there's a few reasons why. Remember, the marginal tax rates for the United States between 1945 to 1978 were about the highest tax rate was 91%. So I think it was the cutoff was about 700,000, which is like 1.9 million in today's dollars. So if you made anything over 1.9 million, that was taxed away at 91%. So a wealth tax, a high marginal tax rate, it's not unprecedented. And there's so much pressure to give for a wealth tax today. It's not only coming from politicians, but in 2022, 100 millionaires and billionaires actually signed a declaration asking their respective governments to tax them more, and they presented it to the World Economic Forum. So pressure is coming from politicians, economists, even countries are asking for a wealth tax on the rich. And the wealthy themselves are asking for it as well. So I really think it's just a matter of time, okay? Do you have success stories of local governments enacting change? I do, but it's in my data. Um, there's actually several organizations that are they're mostly in Europe, but at the top of my head I can't think of them. If you Google local change and climate change, I'm sure it'll bring up the article on the Guardian where I found my data. I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I can't think of the names of the organization. I had like 1,100 citations throughout my book. Um, okay. Curious about the move to heat reflecting roofs, even a simple change to white roofs. Yeah, so there's a organization called Cool Roofs New York, and it's actually really cool because they integrate job training for young people with painting roofs white. I think this organization, it started out in 2010. So now they've already painted millions of square feet in New York City. They've painted millions of square feet white, and this movement is also taking place in throughout other cities throughout the United States as well. So it's a very cheap and effective way to cool buildings that doesn't cost very much, and it also reduces the surrounding temperatures, so it reduces the urban heat effect as well. Okay. Let's see. Okay, with deforestation continuing, should there be more focus on planting trees in cities, in particular to reduce the heat impact of pavement? Is this happening anywhere? I saw a couple of news clips about dropping temperatures by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, no, that's about accurate. There is, so part of the Inflation Reduction Act allocated, I think it was 10 billion. I'm not exactly sure about the number, but it was in the billions of dollars to tree planting schemes in cities. Okay. What studies have found is that it's for forest, rewilding is actually much better than tree planting, because tree planting leads to things like monoculture. It leads to a lack of biodiversity. And also, if they're not well managed, about 90% of the trees planted die within 5 years. So tree planting isn't really appropriate in the wild. Rewilding is much better. So this means things like protecting, just protecting areas, putting compost down, and adding animals. Planting trees in cities is appropriate because there's already a lack of biodiversity. Again, the trees need to be well managed and protected, and made sure that they stay alive. Obviously, New York City estimated that the value it gets from its trees are $122 million per year. I think Florida, a city in Florida, estimated that it gets about $50 million. And this comes from cooling the temperature. It comes from better healthcare, stress relief, better air quality. So trees have an economic impact, a monetary impact that hasn't been accounted for until recently. Okay. Let's see. I put the links for my book in the chat box. Let's see. I don't see any other questions. Is there a network of climate change solution activists, informers, developers? Okay, so one of the best, I think, is the Climate Change Lobby. And they actually have a lot of volunteer opportunities. It's a very mature climate change activist group. Again, the name is the Climate Change Lobby. Or wait, hold on. I think it might be the Citizens, CCL. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. It's the Citizens Climate Lobby. Okay, and let me get the link to that. They have a lot of volunteer opportunities in the United States. Also, I think they're global. But what they do is they lobby for a what's called a fee and dividend tax. So this is a carbon tax, but the money, instead of going to the government, it goes to poor people who the tax would affect the most. So basically, what would they be doing is it would be taxing, say, like fuel, and they would then take the money from the tax to give to people in lower income brackets, so it wouldn't hurt them, and so that they could also take that money and put it into things like buying solar panels, buying heat pumps, things like that. Okay, so what would you tell a 19-year-old that is feeling like his generation has to clean up our mess to encourage him? I would say, look, there is hope. Like I said, we're not where we need to be, but we're actually not that far off. Because if you understand how exponentiality works, it doesn't work in a linear way. It's slow, 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 and then change explodes, right? That's what I was getting to about the 25% rule. Social change is flat lines, and then it explodes. So I would say just keep pushing forward. Do the 3 things that I suggested. Give money to the charities that I suggested. Talk to your friends about it, because we can push, from 4% to 6%, like I said. Let's see. One more question. Oceans in particular are the area where all the good work could be for nothing. If we allow the oceans to be plundered, combined with higher temperatures, it will do massive damage with weather and remove the primary food source for billions of people. Okay, I don't see a question in there, but you're absolutely right. The thing about oceans, the one really encouraging study that I've seen. I mean, if you've been paying attention to the news, I think we're about out of time, but I'm just going to finish on this. If you've been paying attention to the news, you've seen that there's been a recovery of marine mammals. Okay, this has been, we've been seeing record numbers of sharks in Cape. God, what's it called? In Martha's Vineyard, around Martha's Vineyard. There's been record numbers of sharks. We've seen recovery of whales and dolphins in New York. And that's because of measures that were taken back in the 1970s. It was called Marine Mammals Protection Act, right? So a study published in Nature said that if we really do a good job of protecting the ocean now, we could see an 80 to 90% recovery by 2050 of the ocean's abundance in past years. So that's pretty encouraging. So we're taking the ocean recovers pretty fast in about 2 to 3 decades. We can see fish stocks recover in about a decade. So that's pretty encouraging. The coral reefs are dying in Florida. Yes, they are. But we also see recovering coral reefs in Australia. The Great Barrier Reef saw some of the biggest recoveries, the biggest growth in coral reefs in 2022 that they've seen in 30 years. Okay, and this shows that coral reefs are also adapting to the heat. Okay. Anyway, I'm sorry. That's my talk. I really appreciate your time. And please take a look at my book. And thank you for attending my session. Have a nice day.